I have here a library book. This is called We Are Your Sons by Robert and Michael Meeropol. Meeropol is their adopted name. Their birth name is Robert and Michael Rosenberg. These are the children of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, aka the Rosenbergs, aka the Rosenberg spies. So there is a lot to talk about with this book, and I'm going to do my best to get everything out there as quickly as I can. The camera I'm using has a 30-minute time limit, and then it will automatically cut off, so that's my standard time limit. I'm going to have to talk fast and just try and explain everything. So this book is about the children of the Rosenbergs. Who are the Rosenbergs? The Rosenbergs are a man and wife, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were executed in the United States in 1953 for being communist spies, for passing along government secrets from the US to the communist government in Russia. There was a big debate at the time about whether or not they were guilty. And there was a big movement, and in fact an international movement, to get them their sentence commuted or get them a new trial. It was a big deal at the time. But in spite of this big protest movement, the US government executed them anyways. Now, since that time, I think opinion has gone back and forth as to their guilt. When I was in high school in the early 90s, my high school teacher told us that they were innocent. I think that was partly his personal bias, but that was a popular view at the time, that the Rosenbergs were completely innocent and they had been executed by mistake or by a bungling of justice. Since that time, there's been a number of new evidence that's come out, new documents released by the US government and also by the Russian government. And I think that it looks like the consensus is now that Julius Rosenberg actually was a spy, and he did actually collect government secrets and pass them on to Russia. However, the material that he gave to the Russians was actually not all that useful. He didn't give them all that much that they didn't already have. And that's significant because one of the reasons he was sentenced to death is because the judge at his trial said, I think the death penalty is appropriate for you because with the atomic secrets that you've given Russia, you've put millions of American lives in danger. And the judge also held him responsible for Russian aggression in the Korean War, which resulted in American casualties in Korea. So the judge held him responsible for this, and that was part of the rationale for the death penalty. The wife, however, Ethel Rosenberg, it looks like she is completely innocent, or at least completely innocent of the charges that were against her. So she may have had some knowledge of her husband's spy ring, probably had some knowledge of her husband's spy ring, but what she was actually on trial for was participating in the spy ring, specifically typing up notes for the spy ring. And that she did not do. That was a result of her brother and sister-in-law perjuring themselves to get the blame off of themselves and onto her. And also just the government wanting to convict her on the death penalty to use as leverage against Julius Rosenberg. So sorry, I know that was a lot of information. Did you get all that? The main point is Rosenbergs executed in 1953. Big debate ever since then about whether or not they were guilty. Current consensus is Julius Rosenberg was guilty, although probably not deserving of the death penalty. Ethel Rosenberg was not guilty, although she may have known about the spying. But take a step back from that. The Rosenbergs had 2 young children who were, I believe, I think about 7 years old and 3 years old when they were arrested in 1951, who were just a few years older in 1953 when they were executed. And those 2 children, when they became adults, wrote a book about their experiences. And there is a lot of interesting stuff in this book. Now, why am I reading this? Years ago, many years ago, when I was a college student, I would go into the library to study, and sometimes when I would get a little bit bored with my studying, I would browse the library and just pick up random books that would look interesting and read sections of them. And this was such a book that I picked up I guess it was almost 30 years ago now, 25 years ago when I was a college student. And didn't read the whole thing, but read parts of it. And those parts stuck in my mind. And so now that I'm back in the US and have access to interlibrary loan and I'm able to track down a lot of these books that I couldn't get when I was living abroad, I thought this would be interesting to revisit. And not only to revisit, but actually read the whole thing cover to cover, which I never did before. But yeah, I remember a lot of their recollections kind of sticking in my mind from when I was just reading sections of this book many years ago. Now, these 2 young boys went through something that no children should ever have to go through, which is to have their parents taken away from them and executed. But before the execution, there was the trial, and then there was a couple year-long appeals process where they were visiting their parents in jail regularly, but always knew, at least the older one always knew, that the threat of death was hanging over their parents. And then their parents finally were executed. So, you know, the final visit to the prison to meet with their parents. Sorry, I get myself a little bit worked up just thinking about it. That final visit to meet with their parents, the parting, knowing it was probably going to be the last time they saw them, the older one going out to play catch baseball with his friend the night of their execution, and then coming back, and they were still hoping at the last minute the president might commute them, but then being told that there was no commutation and their parents were dead. Just all the emotions that they had throughout this whole trial, and their relationship with their parents, and you know, it from all accounts, their parents really loved them. They really loved their parents, and for any child to go through that is just terrible. So there's that really heartbreaking part of it, and that is all in here. Now, their memories are a little bit spotty, especially the younger one, who was only 3 years old when the mother was arrested. But they jot down what memories they have. They supplement that with the prison letters from their parents. They also interview people who knew them to kind of reconstruct the story. But it's a lot of their memories coming through. So, for example, one example is the older one, Michael Meeropol, when his mother was arrested. The father was arrested first, and then the mother was arrested a little bit later. He was visiting his mother in jail the day she was arrested, and when the mother said to him on the, I guess, prison phones during the visiting that, yes, I have been arrested and I will be staying in jail, apparently he let out a blood-curdling scream that haunted his mother for many months afterwards. But he said, I've completely blocked that out of my memory. They tell me I did that, but I don't remember doing that. But he does remember the FBI coming in to arrest his mother. He does remember that he was listening to a radio program and that the FBI agent kept switching off the program he was trying to listen to. So those recollections are in there. He's got recollections of some of the rallies that they were taken to by the organizations that were organized to try and campaign to save their parents. He's got memories of being ostracized by some of the neighborhood kids. Like he's playing with a friend and he goes into the friend's house. The friend's mother said, "Are you the son of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg?" And he says, "Yes, I am. And in fact, if you read the papers," and the mother says, "I don't want to hear about it." And then the mother says, "Okay, it's time to go." And she as he's leaving, he says, "Don't you ever come near my son again." It was a height of, 1950s height of the Red Scare, the communist paranoia. So that they were both traumatized by that experience. At the other hand, they were national and international symbols of a cause, and so they were both adored by a certain segment of the American society and demonized by another one. It was a very traumatic thing for kids to go through, which is part of the reason why they were so eager to change their names when they got adopted to Meeropol, and lived in fear for many years after about their about the press finding out about them. The press or anyone finding out about their identities. They really relished becoming anonymous once the adoption was finalized. There's a whole bunch of stuff in here about them being in different children group homes, the experiences they have there. It's all in the book. You can track down. Now, this book, this is the second edition I have here, which was published in 1986. First edition, I believe, was published in 1975. I think it's long out of print, but you can track it down on Amazon. You can probably track it down in interlibrary loan at your local library. It's worth tracking down. A lot of interesting stuff in here. According to Wikipedia, Robert Meeropol, the younger brother, published his memoirs in 2003. I was just doing some research on Wikipedia before filming this review. And I read that and I thought, what do you mean he published his memoirs? They already had memoirs. This is their memoirs. But I guess Robert Meeropol has published another book of memoirs, which, if anybody's read it, let me know how it is. I don't suppose there's anybody out there who's read both of them and can do a little compare and contrast. So that one was published in 2003. That one would be the more recent one. But yeah, this is the one I read. Okay, anyways. There's a lot of interesting stuff in there, but the first half of the book, the majority of it is taken up with them republishing selected correspondence from their parents. The prison letters that their parents wrote to each other, and the prison letters that their parents wrote to them. And these letters have apparently been already published elsewhere, and collections of like the Rosenberg's prison letters, which I guess were published sometime in the 50s or something. So it's I guess not the first time these letters have been published, but they're being published here for the purposes of, well, for a number of purposes. One, to show what loving parents their parents actually were. And their parents talk in these letters about their anguish about being separated from their kids, and how cruel it is to be missing out on their kids growing up and worrying about their kids and all that kind of stuff. but also to pad out their own memories during the early years where their memories are a little bit fuzzy and they don't have that many recollections to write about. They will use their, I think that's another purpose of using their parents' letters. In my opinion, the letters from their parents, which make up the bulk of the first half of the book, can get a little bit tiresome. That's largely because there's no narrative. The parents are talking about their feelings. They're trying to explore how they feel about being in prison. They're looking ahead towards posterity, thinking about how posterity is going to remember them. They're thinking about injustices in the U.S. They're reflecting on all sorts of things. But the story is not moving anywhere. And so, when they break from their parents' letters to tell their story about how they were put in this group home or how they experienced this, then I'm like, oh, okay, this is an interesting story they have. But when they get back to their parents' letters, I think I could have done maybe with a little bit less of their parents' letters. Now, that being said, their parents' letters are incredibly well written, and which is, when you think that their parents weren't professional writers, they were just people. It's amazing how well they're constructed. It reminds me of collections of Victorian letters. When you read those old letters that people wrote back in the 1800s, and they're just so well written, and you think, wow, we have lost the style of writing nowadays. And maybe we have lost the style of writing nowadays, right? Maybe television and everything has ruined people's ability to really write well. And maybe back in the 1950s, people were able to just write much more eloquently. I don't know, but the letters are very eloquently written. Given what we now know, that Julius Rosenberg was definitely a spy, and when this book was published, both the first edition and the second edition in 1975 and 1986, the files that prove that Julius Rosenberg was definitely a spy were not released yet. So this book is dated in that respect. But you read these letters where Julius Rosenberg is saying, I'm so innocent, this is a travesty of justice, this is all a frame-up, and you think to yourself, what an art for self-delusion he had. I mean, now, he probably didn't deserve to be executed. I mean, in my opinion, because one, apparently the information he gave to Stalin was not all that useful to the Soviet government anyways, although I'm not sure how many people knew that at the time. Two, because the death penalty is just a very cruel punishment, especially for like a non-violent crime like this, especially when you're orphaning two children. So I don't think he deserved to be executed, but he was not as innocent of these charges as he was making out. Especially near the end, they are approached by government agents who offer them a deal. And they said, if you just tell us what you'll know, we will go to the president and recommend leniency. So, Julius Rosenberg and his wife said, no, we are innocent. You're not going to bamboozle us like this. We demand a new trial. And the government agent says, look, a trial's not going to happen. It's just impossible. It's not the way the court system works. He's like, look, I know the sentence they gave you was too harsh, but this is the only way out. It's the only way that we can find some way to get you out of this. Just tell us what you know, and we'll recommend clemency to the president. And we know all this because it's reported in the letters that Julius Rosenberg himself wrote. He wrote down that whole conversation where the government agent is pleading with them and saying, look, this is the only way out. Just talk. And you're reading this and you want to say, Julius, just talk. You've got 2 little boys. You're going to leave as orphans. Don't do this to those boys. I don't know. I guess he was just so set on being a martyr by this point, or, maybe his pride wouldn't let him go back on it, or who knows what his internal motivations are. But it's interesting reading this now, knowing what we know. So that's the first half of the book. I haven't even gotten to the second half of the book. I'm going to have to speak fast. I've only got 10 minutes left. To a certain extent, the second half of the book is where this gets really fascinating, because it talks about the boys growing up in the shadow of what had happened to their parents, trying to be anonymous, growing up in a very conservative American society, but having these left-wing sympathies that they're trying to hide. But then, of course, comes the 1960s, where everything begins to change. And the younger one, Robert Meeropol, especially becomes very active in radical student politics. So he describes kind of it, building up his courage to voice his opinions when he was in high school. By this time, it's about 1965, and he is going to a Methodist college in the Midwest, which he thinks is actually going to be more liberal than it is. Because, was it Methodist or Quaker? It's one of those colleges in the Midwest. And he thinks it's actually going to be more liberal than it is, because he's associating it with the progressive part of that church's politics, but it's actually a really conservative school. But it's the 60s, things are changing. He talks about the trying to organize some sort of movement there, getting involved with the other sympathetic people, and in spite of this very conservative environment, they are able to mount some protests there. But after a year of that and kind of getting frustrated, maybe it was 2 years, I don't remember, a year or two of that, he decides to transfer out. And he goes to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, which is in my neck of the woods. I'm from Michigan, currently in Michigan right now. And the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in the 1960s was really popping. It was one of the centers of student activism. The SDS, or Students for a Democratic Society, was in Ann Arbor. Ann Arbor was also where they were beginning to factionalize and fracture into different pieces. The weather underground, or the weathermen, were beginning to break off. That was all happening in Ann Arbor. He was doesn't sound like he was one of the leaders, but he describes these protest movements he was at, and the various events and the battles with the police. And if you're interested in the student protests in the 1960s, and as I've mentioned before on this channel, at one time I was very interested in that, mostly when I was younger, then this is a fascinating account, of eyewitness account of street battles in the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor during the time, by somebody who was there. But it's also fascinating because of the personal journey of these brothers. At a time when the country was so reactionary, anti-communist, that their parents were killed. I should have mentioned this earlier in the video, but his parents were definitely communist. They were open members of the Communist Party at one point. So there was debate for years about whether or not they were communist spies, but there was never any debate about whether they were communists. Anyways, he's seen his parents killed by that reactionary anti-communist hysteria in the 1950s. But now he's seeing the communism becoming really in vogue, and radical in politics becoming really in vogue with the new generation in the 1960s. But then, that wave crests and then it rides out. So he goes to Europe at one point for anthropological studies. And he's in these rural villages in Spain where he's just removed from all this chaos and fighting that he was describing a few pages earlier happening back at the University of Michigan. He says being in these idyllic, peaceful villages just reset his brain and made him think, what were we doing in the U.S.? That was nuts, that all those violent fights we were getting into. And then he goes back to the U.S. and, by 1971, the movement has just burned itself out. And I think exactly why the 1960s movement burned out so quickly is a subject of some speculation and discussion. He just kind of postulates here that there was just so much energy that it just burned itself out. Everyone just exhausted themselves. And then, in the aftermath of that, they go on and start their new lives. The third part of this book and the last 3 chapters are them making the case for their parents' innocence and refuting some popular books which were apparently published in the 1980s. So this is part 3, going public. You could probably skip this part if you read this book. I read it just because I'm a completist. When I read a book, I like to read it cover to cover. But the information in here is all dated. Given what we now know, we now know way more than they did in this case. It's somewhat interesting kind of seeing them play with the evidence as they have it. But a lot of it is a little bit inside baseball. It's almost, they're assuming an audience who kind of is very familiar with the case. So, maybe 40 years ago, people were more familiar with all the people involved in the Rosenberg case. But it's the kind of thing that's more suitable to read maybe after you've read an exhaustive study of the Rosenberg case. And they spend a lot of space refuting a book that had come out, I guess, in the 1980s, which I don't think anyone ever talks about that book now. So, it's all dated, and fair enough, this book is out of print. The only way you can get it is to find it at your library or order a used copy off of Amazon. If you're not a completist, you can solve this problem by just skipping the end of the book. I'm just about out of time. I've talked about most of the things I've wanted to talk about in this book. There's a lot of little interesting anecdotes and episodes and stuff like that, which I didn't get around to talking about, but you can't retell the whole book in 30 minutes. You'll have to get this book and read it for yourself. If you're at all interested in the Rosenbergs or this time period, or just, American history generally, or, just interested in this just because it's an interesting story, check it out. There's a lot of interesting stuff in here. If you get the second edition, you can skip the last third. This last third apparently wasn't in the first edition. The first half of the book, like I said, is taken up by the prison correspondence of their parents, which is somewhat interesting, but gets tiresome after a while. Again, if you're not a completist, I suppose you could skim some of those letters. But the stories of the children themselves is fascinating, heartbreaking, at times. And those at times meaning, them having to live with the full knowledge that their parents were going to be executed. And then living with their knowledge that their parents were executed. It's a heartbreaking story. But it's a fascinating story. And then as they go on to make their own lives, it's an interesting story. Recommend.